Welcome to Design Emergency, the podcast that investigates design's fundamental role in our life and in that of all species and ecosystems. I'm Paola Antonelli, and together with Alice Rosthorn, I believe that design is not only one of the highest expressions of human ingenuity, but also a means to address emergencies big and small, even and especially those of our own making. And among the big, very big, humongous emergencies is the havoc that we have wreaked on the environment. Today, in particular, we will focus on the oceans and will be in conversation with designer and researcher Pirjo Haikola out of Townsville, North Queensland, Australia. So, the state of the oceans under the strain of climate change is a sobering reflection of the planet's rapidly shifting climate. Coral reefs, which are vital ecosystems supporting roughly 25% of all marine species, are among the most visible casualties of warming seas. Since the late 20th century, global ocean temperatures have risen by an average of 0.13 centigrades per decade. And this warming leads to coral bleaching, which is a stress response where corals expel the symbiotic algae that give them their color and that provide their essential nutrients. So in 2016 alone, over 90% of the Great Barrier Reef experienced bleaching, and an estimated 29% of its coral was lost in a single year. Pirjo, you are a designer, a researcher, a scuba diving instructor, a sailor, an ocean advocate, and an underwater photography enthusiast. And you focus on the intersection of marine ecology, sustainability, and design. How did you come to this job description?
Yeah, that's a quite a long story, but let's see if I can recap that one.
We have all the times in the world,
All the time
so
in the
tell us.
world. Yeah. So I'm an industrial designer by background, and I have worked in industry and in academia as a designer. But then at some point, I felt that creating more stuff to this world was not really satisfying anymore. All this stuff that we really don't need, why do I need to be designing more of it? And I took a break and I decided to become a diving instructor, a little pivot, because I really love the ocean. And I ended up going to work at the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia first. And I was here in 2016, 17, that summer that you were just talking about. And I was there at the reef every day going to work. And at our workplace, we witnessed this happening with our own eyes. We saw the bleaching happening. We saw all the really alarming news headlines, and all the tourists were asking us, what is going on here? And that was really impactful for all of us. And after that, I ended up working in Mexico at the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, which also suffers from very negative human impacts. And after that, I really thought that maybe I actually need to go back to design, but to work out if design could do something for the oceans, if designer skills could be somehow helpful in helping the oceans as well. So I kind of went back to the design world again, and started to investigate how could design be part of, say, environmental conservation and restoration and different efforts like that. And I'm still on that journey 10 years later.
It's really interesting because you began in your country of origin, which is Finland, and you moved all the way, slowly but surely, going south and then moving towards the other side of the world. And now you're in Townsville. And you moved from a rather traditional, albeit very enlightened, education in industrial design for, as they used to say once upon a time, human-centered design, to instead working with coral as a client. How did that happen?
I mean, that's an interesting thing. Like I was just describing a bit my journey, how I went from design and becoming a diving instructor, seeing what happens there, and then finding a way for design to be part of these kinds of efforts of helping ocean restoration and conservation efforts. But, it's really interesting because industrial design traditionally has been really part of developing systems and technologies to mass produce goods to the world. And we have become very good at optimizing these processes, but at a very high cost to the environment. But then at the same time, when we now have quite a big emergency with the environment, a lot of efforts that we are developing to help the environment need to be scaled up as well. So some of these skills from a designer of technologies, systems, production, mass production can actually be quite useful for some of these interventions that we need to scale up to actually help the environment and not hurt it. So I think designers have some interesting input to give in this area that we are traditionally not doing. So to me, that's a very radical shift, like you were saying, from we have been educated in human-centered design, and now we have to pivot to do more than human-centered design, or more than human design rather, because it's not centric to anything. It has to include the entire ecosystems and many species. But we have a lot of skills. Even though we come from that human-centered world, we are sensitive to learn new methods. We can work with and collaborate with different disciplines. Like in my case, it's often marine scientists, marine ecologists. We have to find new collaborations with disciplines that can help us understand these clients. Because we can't ask them. You can't ask a coral, what would you like? Or when we've designed something, whether that was a good design for them. You have to find other ways to understand what they need.
I really wanted to ask you, is coral a good client? Because, sometimes the best clients are the ones that really help you do the best work. So is coral a good client?
They are very tricky clients because they're quite sensitive. So it's a big effort from really a lot of disciplines, a lot of people to understand how we can help them. They are so beautiful and in a way very resilient because they build these amazing, huge reefs, but at the same time, they're quite sensitive. And to understand them takes quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of research at the same time.
Everything that you do tends to be very much about the context where you are. And for instance, in 2020, when you were in Melbourne, you were teaching actually at RMIT, which is a really great school for design and architecture that's based in Melbourne. You worked on the NGV triennial. The NGV is in the National Gallery Victoria, where my beloved colleagues always do some of the best commissioned work. And you really focused on not only corals, but urchin. Can you please tell us about that extraordinary installation?
Yeah, that was quite an interesting time. Like you said, I was working at RMIT University at the time. And I was working on we could call it the sea urchin invasion in Port Phillip Bay. So Port Phillip Bay is right in front of Melbourne. And the numbers of the native sea urchin are growing so big that they are basically eating away these really important seaweed habitats, because seaweed is what their food, right? So to kind of draw attention to that and do something about that, we were creating events where we were cooking things to replace traditional seafood with urchins, for instance. We were investigating properties in the shells of the urchin and the pigments in their shells, which are also, by the way, they're just amazing. They are so complex, and they are kind of like the immune system of the urchin. They protect them from a lot of things. They are anti-algal, antifungal, antibacterial, all kinds of things like that. So I was working on those kind of pretty strange experiments and working with the public to bring some attention to this. At the same time, I had just started to collaborate with the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program for the Great Barrier Reef. I can explain that a little bit more later, but that's a bigger story. And in that program, at the time, I was helping the researchers investigate some materials that would be safe for the corals, for them to grow on, would be safe for the marine environment, and could maybe even protect the corals. And at that moment, I was asked to produce an installation for the triennial that could maybe highlight these two very different areas. And so I decided that I wanted to create an installation that would advance, let's say, ocean literacy in a way, bring attention to these two very different types of ecosystems that are suffering from human impacts, resulting in pretty devastating results. And of course, the coral bleaching and the Great Barrier Reef is very known, even though the sea urchin problem is right at the doorstep of Melbourne and people living there don't even know that's happening. So putting these two things side by side, drawing attention to things that there are a lot of issues, a lot of urgencies that we should act on.
So I'm looking at these sculptures here. It's almost like sculptures or abstraction of coral. So how did you you said you wanted to change and improve ocean literacy. So how did this installation achieve it?
Yeah, so for the installation, we actually also made 2 underwater videos with a fantastic underwater photographer, videographer, producer, and a very good friend of mine, Tom Park. We did lots of diving in these 2 places to create these underwater videos, which go from these really vibrant, colorful, beautiful, healthy areas and transition to these degrading environments. And they're shown side by side. So they're almost like 2 windows simultaneously showing these 2 environments. And the installation itself, as you said, were these corals, like almost like a coral reefscape. 3D printed corals using different types of biopolymers I was experimenting with, also mixed with sea urchin powder and sea urchin pigments. So many variations of filaments that I created for that installation, and then 3D printed these corals that are actually real corals, and they are photogrammetry of living corals from the reef too. So it was a replication that wanted to show material exploration, show these places in real life, what they look like right now.
And also what they look like when they're suffering. You talked about the fact that very often when we think of the ocean, we think of this like blooming, beautiful, vivid, alive place. And just seeing firsthand and first eye what it means when the ocean is dying, when it becomes a desolate place, is something that can really shake your understanding of nature.
Yeah, it's very powerful, especially when you have the ability to see it firsthand with your own eyes. If you are able to dive or snorkel or free dive or whatever you do, but most people don't, right? So most people are not there to see that. And say, because of that reason, for instance, in Port Phillip Bay, it's a very cold bay. The water is really cold. Not a lot of people go diving there or free diving or snorkeling there. So that's why people don't actually see it with their own eyes. So you kind of need to bring it up from above the surface and show them what is happening as well. So I think design can also play a role in visualizing things and creating ocean literacy or environmental literacy.
It definitely does. And so were the sculptures or the corals there 3D printed with the biopolymers?
That's right. Yeah. Using different kinds of printers, we use one huge printer to create some of the bigger corals, and then some smaller printers to do some of the smaller pieces. So that was, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of hours of printing that was. I can't even remember. It was very many hours of work.
Well, it was all worth it, I have to say. And I'm sure that my colleagues, the curators of that part of the exhibition were Ewan McCoy and Simone Liamon, my beloved colleagues. So this idea of 3D printing with biopolymers leads us to talk about this other gigantic project of yours that I find really fascinating, which is the one for the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, RRAP. Can you talk about that amazing program and also describe a bit the kind of output of your research? So
the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program is a huge program. Obviously, I can't even remember how many scientists are working on it. I think the last I heard was somewhere around 360 researchers that are part of the program. So I am one of very, very many people. As I said, I was at RMIT University first when I was collaborating with the program, and I currently work at the Australian Institute of Marine Science in the pilot deployment program. To kind of explain a little bit this relationship and the programs is that RRAP has been developing interventions that will help the coral reefs resist and adapt to and recover from these impacts of ocean temperatures. And then the pilot deployment program that I'm currently working on is scaling up and operationalizing these interventions. So like I was mentioning earlier, how design can help in terms of taking knowledge from industries and upscaling interventions and so on. That is exactly what we are doing at the moment. So we are trying to find ways to really improve the scale, efficacy, feasibility, cost, safety of these interventions. And then I can get into the actual interventions a little bit. So in the next few years, we are focusing on two main methods. The one is that we are rearing young corals in coral aquaculture facilities on land. And then we take these corals on these seeding devices out to sea and deploy them in areas that need help. The other method, we have kind of pools that we have there out at sea, and we collect coral slick during spawning events into these pools, and then place the devices into these pools. And when coral larvae are settled on them, we again deploy the devices to the reef, but we also release the rest of the coral slick and larvae back to the reef in the areas that needs help. So these are really the two methods we are currently upscaling and operationalizing. A bit more in detail, the coral aquaculture method, we have these little seeding devices that you just mentioned. They look like stars with 2 or 3 arms, and they are made of
How big are they?
Kind of like a little bit smaller than the size of your hand. So they're quite small. Alumina ceramic is really heavy, so it's kind of helpful because we are deploying them from the surface. But the ceramic also protects the corals. It's very hard, so it protects them from grazing fish. And it's designed in a way to also give these protected nooks for the corals to grow in without being grazed by fish. So they're really specifically designed to protect the corals and then also integrate into the reef and become part of the reef.
Are they all the same shape, or do you also...
Currently, yes. They are the same shape because they are kind of the initial stage where the corals will then grow out from. But the device will help it kind of retain itself in place and then kind of grows and becomes part of the reef, and the corals will grow out of it. But the corals are actually settled in aquaculture on these tiles that almost look like chocolate blocks, and they are made of concrete. And then we take these pieces of the tile and place them on seeding devices, and then we take them out. To kind of maximize scale and efficiency, we are growing them in more like tight environments, and then the seeding device kind of helps to protect it, but it can be assembled later.
How do you decide where to position them? Do you have a modeling team that tells you where you could maximize the impact of these implants?
Yeah, so there's a big effort in modeling the right environments and suitable locations where we will do these interventions. So that is definitely a big part of the program as well.
And how would you describe your role as a designer there? Are you the one that decides the shape, or is it instead more long-fetched and really talking about how the whole regrowth can happen?
Yeah, so I've been part of a little bit of both sides. So in the earlier stages, and still a little bit now, I work on some of the design aspects of the devices and production. But at the moment, it's more, my role is more being part of developing this system, coordinating these efforts with my colleagues, and really upscaling and making sure that we can produce the numbers we need to produce, and that we have all these supply chains and also community groups that support us. So the other side of this that I haven't mentioned yet is that for the pilot deployment program, a really crucial part is working with various industries, community groups, who will then carry out these interventions in the future. So a couple of months ago, during the 2024 spawning event, we were out on the reef doing one of our capacity building exercises. So we had some tourism industry groups, we had traditional owners and other community groups with us at the reef. And we were working together with these larval pools, collecting the coral slick at the spawning, settling the devices, and then deploying them all together and learning with each other how to do this. And it was just so fantastic to see how enthusiastic the community and all the participants were to be part of this, and how keen they were to learn. And we had so much fun. It's quite hot out there. We have really long days and we work pretty hard out there, but we had so much fun, and it's really heartwarming to see that they're so keen to basically take on these interventions and continue working with us in the future.
Did you bring them all to dive with you?
Well, a lot of people got to snorkel and get into the water. We couldn't really get everyone to scuba dive, but we all pretty much got to get a bit of snorkeling time and swimming time in as well.
I want to catch on this term, getting to the water, because clearly your way of designing is about field work. And I know that our MIT was a place where you taught a lot, but then there's also collaborations with amazing, really empathetic with nature designers like Julia Lohman, where field work is also emphasized. So I'm wondering, Julia she's a German designer, is now based in Finland at the Aalto University. And I know that her way of teaching is quite experimental, as is yours. What do you think needs to change in the way we teach design for young designers to really embrace the more than human and this decentralized way of designing?
Well, it is going to be a bit of a journey, because we have to find new methods that we collaborate with these other disciplines. We have to learn a little bit more how to, let's say, when it comes to, say, materials, the criteria that the non-human clients have for materials can be quite complex. And we can use some of our expertise in manufacturing technologies and things like that, obviously. But we have to really rethink a lot of the materials and a lot of the methods and a lot of the collaborations that we need. So it is definitely a very different paradigm of design. And luckily there are a lot of amazing colleagues like Julia and a lot of my colleagues at RMIT and at other universities who are developing these ways of working for the non-human clients and stakeholders, like I like to say.
And I would like to also address this idea of design being able to change culture at large. You've been talking about ocean literacy, and I know that in 2019 you curated a show with Julia at the Design Museum in Helsinki that was called Critical Tide. Could you tell me more about it? I know that the curators were you, Julia, then Gillian Russell and Gero Grundmann, and it was like a collaboration. What was that exhibition about? And do you think that it had a very strong effect?
When we decided to propose that exhibition for the Design Museum, Julia and I had started to teach together a bit, and we both realized that we both work in the ocean context, and we're both really keen on developing some of these ways of how do we teach this? How do we research this? How do we even speak about this? It's such an unusual area of design, really. And there were so few practitioners around that we thought maybe by curating an exhibition and pulling together a lot of practitioners and artists into the same exhibition, we could kind of together start to figure out what is this landscape? How do we work and design in this area? So it was definitely a bit of an experiment in that way too. And I think we learned a lot about how different designers and artists think about this and all the different ways that people work. So some work more directly with communities, kind of co-creating pieces or involving the community in kind of interventions and actions and things like that. And some create more pieces like what I was talking about, video installations where you can see impacts or that are more reflective. And then there are designers like myself and Alex Goad and a few others who are really trying to be part of creating something for the environment, not just for people, but actually creating things that will benefit the environment directly. It was a very interesting curation experience. And Julia and I continued to work together for quite a bit after that as well. And we taught together for quite a long time too, did studios on seaweed and traveled to Sweden to a seaweed farm, did all kinds of things together, which was great.
Now, in many cases, the way to deal with the more than human might seem a contemporary concept, an advanced concept, but in reality, it's something that's been happening for centuries and that we seem to have forgotten about in the
Absolutely.
20th century. And so I'm wondering, do you, especially in Australia, which is so sensitive to it, do you involve any citizens of the First Nations that can help in that regrowth? Are they part also of the teams that you all work with?
Well, in the pilot deployment program, of course, we are involving also traditional owner groups in the interventions. Like I was mentioning that we're working with community groups and we are hoping that they will be part of carrying out these interventions in the future as well. So we're definitely collaborating with them and aiming to include as many different community groups as we can to these efforts.
So, Pirjo, what can we do? What are the steps that need to be taken to help the Great Barrier Reef and other coral reefs in the world?
Well, the important things that we really have to do is obviously we have to cut down emissions. That is the biggest threat to the Great Barrier Reef and all the coral reefs in the world. Secondly, we have to focus on local efforts as well and local management. That is really important. And the third part is that we have to continue research efforts and investigating different interventions as well. But the primary reason for why the reefs are suffering are the emissions, and we have to get those in control. But in the meanwhile, we can bridge the time a bit by creating and implementing these interventions.
It's about all coming together from many different sides. It takes really a global and collective effort, and design is a seeding mechanism, pretty much same way you're dealing with the coral.
Yes, I mean, design can be part of it, definitely. And traditionally, designers have not really been part of environmental conservation or restoration efforts. It's quite a new area for us. But there is a lot of work in the ocean and elsewhere as well for designers to be part of these things. But we need engineers, we need ecologists, we need all kinds of disciplines to be able to do these things at scale. And that's what is very important.
And we need citizens.
We need citizens and communities as well. Yes, they have to be part of this as well.
So is there any other project that you worked on that you think we should mention, now that you've understood the trajectory of our conversation?
I think these are the main projects. And I think, of course, this ARAP project, the pilot deployment program, has taken my life pretty much for the last 6 years. So that's been what I've been working on a lot.
You're fully immersed.
I'm fully immersed in this project, and it is really amazing because it's kind of a full circle for me, right? I started here. I was teaching diving here 10 years ago at the reef, and that's when I started to think about whether design could do something for the ocean. And then somehow, 10 years later, I am here, part of this really big, amazing effort. And it's so satisfying to be part of something that I believe can have a really great impact.
And you are really doing it. You're not just researching, which is something that is so important right now because there's been a lot of design research happening. But now I can see that all designers, even the most experimental ones, are moving into actual practice. And it's really wonderful to speak with you because your practice is about reality. It's about problem solving. It's about field work. It's about changing culture. It's about scaling up and involving industry. So it really also is a fabulous example of focus. I really respect the fact that you paused on teaching and are, once again, pardon the pun, fully immersed at the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, and you're just doing it, right?
Yes. I mean, we have such a fabulous team, and it's big effort, but it is at the same time, it's so wonderful to be able to be part of something like this and see it really come to reality in a way.
So this is Design Emergency, and you have just heard from designer, researcher, and environmental innovator, I should say, Pirjo Haikola. Through her work, Pirjo exemplifies how design, science, and personal passion can come together to create meaningful solutions for a sustainable future, even for a future where design is distributed. It's not anymore human-centered, and it's instead for the whole environment and all ecosystems. So remember, you can find images that are related to this interview on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And you can also dig through our archives and find more interviews, either by myself or by Alice Rawsthorne, with designers, architects, and others who are actively working to design a better world for all humans, for all species, for all planets. And Pirjo, thank you so much for a wonderful interview today.
Thank you, Paola, for inviting me. That was really a pleasure.
See you in Australia.
See you, I hope.